March 1943. A German U-boat surfaces in the mid-Atlantic darkness. The crew never suspects the trap, they never see it coming. One moment they are breathing fresh air after weeks underwater, the next they are staring down the barrels of British weapons, and the men pointing those weapons are wearing their own uniforms. The uniforms that fooled them looked like nothing more than standard Kriegsmarine issue. They had the correct insignia, the proper colors, the authentic rank markings. They were, by any conventional assessment, perfect replicas of German naval dress. They were also the most devastating psychological weapon ever deployed against the U-boat fleet. The uniform deception program was never meant to win naval battles. It was meant to win a different kind of war, one fought in mines, in the confusion of surrender, in the space between capture and interrogation. And it did so with an effectiveness so impossibly complete that U-boat crews often revealed critical intelligence before they realized they were speaking to the enemy at all. The problem facing British naval intelligence in 1940 was simple to state and nearly impossible to solve. The Admiralty's Operational Intelligence Center had been tasked with breaking the U-boat threat that was strangling Britain's Atlantic lifeline. Submarines were being sunk, crews were being captured, interrogations were being conducted, but there was one critical gap in the intelligence-gathering process. When a U-boat crew was pulled from the water, they immediately went silent. Training kicked in, protocols were followed. Name, rank, serial number, nothing more. What interrogators needed was a way to extract information before prisoners realized they were prisoners, before training overcame shock. Before silence became their shield, conventional interrogation techniques existed, but they were deeply flawed. Physical coercion was unreliable and violated the Geneva Conventions. Extended isolation took weeks to produce results. Deception through fake Red Cross interviews was transparent to experienced officers. What naval intelligence needed was something that had never existed before, a method so subtle it could extract intelligence within minutes of capture. A technique so convincing it could overcome years of training. A deception so complete it could make enemy sailors believe they were still among friends. The specification seemed impossible. The task fell to a small team within the Naval Intelligence Division's Specialized Interrogation Unit, based initially at the London Cage and later expanded to facilities at Latimer House in Buckinghamshire. The lead architect was Lieutenant Commander Ian Fleming, yes, the future author of James Bond, working alongside interrogation specialists whose expertise in psychological manipulation would remain classified for decades. They approached the problem not as military officers but as stage directors. The capture of a U-boat crew was not an ending. It was an opening scene, and if that scene could be controlled completely, the entire performance would follow. The deception began the moment survivors were pulled from the water. Standard procedure was immediately abandoned. No British accents, no Royal Navy uniforms, no indication whatsoever that they had been captured by the enemy. Instead, the rescue team wore perfect reproductions of Kriegsmarine uniforms. They spoke fluent German, using correct naval terminology, proper slang, authentic regional dialects. The survivors, still in shock from depth charging, hypothermia, near drowning, found themselves surrounded by what appeared to be their own navy. The psychological impact was instantaneous. The brain, overwhelmed by trauma and relief, accepted the simplest explanation. They had been rescued by a German vessel. Help had arrived. They were safe. The uniforms themselves were masterpieces of detail. British intelligence had access to captured German naval clothing from earlier engagements, but simple theft was insufficient. Every button had to match Kriegsmarine specifications. Every thread had to be correct weight and color. Insignia were reproduced using the exact manufacturing techniques employed in German factories. Rank markings followed precise regulations, including the subtle variations that changed throughout the war. Even the cloth itself mattered. German naval wool had a distinctive texture, a specific weight. British mills were quietly tasked with producing identical material. The stitching patterns were studied and replicated. Where patterns were artificially aged to match the appearance of uniforms that had been through months at sea. When a U-boat sailor looked at these uniforms, even in clear daylight, nothing triggered suspicion. But clothing was only the first layer. The men wearing those uniforms required training that went far beyond language instruction. Standard German naval protocols were studied exhaustively. How did Kriegsmarine officers address subordinates? What were the informal hierarchies within U-boat crews? What topics dominated conversation during off-duty hours? What jokes were common? What slang was current? British personnel selected for this program underwent immersive preparation that lasted months. They studied not just the language but the culture. they learned the names of popular German songs. They memorized the current standings in the Bundesliga. They knew which cigarette brands were preferred, which cities had been bombed most recently, which military leaders were privately despised. When these men spoke to captured U-boat crews, they did not sound like translators reading from a script. They sounded like comrades. The physical staging was equally meticulous. Captured crews were not taken to obviously British facilities. They were transported to specially prepared buildings where every detail reinforced the deception. Signs were in German. Notices on walls displayed Kriegsmarine regulations. Calendars showed German dates and holidays. Even the food was authentic, prepared using German recipes, served on dishware that matched Kriegsmarine standard issue. Newspapers were available, carefully prepared fakes that reported fictional German victories and real Allied setbacks. Radio broadcasts played in common areas, featuring German announcers discussing the progress of the war from an Axis perspective. Every sensory input supported the same lie. You are among friends, you are still serving Germany, you can speak freely. The interrogations themselves were not interrogations at all, at least not in any recognizable form. There were no bright lights, no hard chairs, no aggressive questioning. Instead, captured officers and crew were simply allowed to socialize with their apparent rescuers. Conversations were casual. Did the patrol go well before the attack? How long had they been at sea? What was the crew morale like? These were not questions from an interrogator. These were the normal inquiries one sailor makes to another. And in responding, in the relief of survival and the comfort of apparent camaraderie, U-boat crews revealed everything. They discussed their patrol routes. They complained about mechanical problems with their boats. They mentioned recent orders from BDU, the U-boat command. They gossiped about other crews, other boats, other operations. Every word was noted, every detail was recorded, not through obvious note-taking, but through hidden microphones embedded in walls, concealed in light fixtures, buried in furniture. The effectiveness was extraordinary. A standard interrogation of an uncooperative U-boat officer might take weeks and yield minimal intelligence. The Uniform Deception Program produced comprehensive debriefings within hours. Officers who would have died before revealing their orders to a British interrogator freely discussed those same orders with a friendly German commander over cigarettes and coffee. Crew members who had been trained to resist capture protocols never activated those protocols because they never believed they had been captured. The mental trigger that initiated silence simply never fired. One documented operation from May 1943 illustrates the technique perfectly. U-456, commanded by Captain Lieutenant Max Martin Teichert, was depth-charged and forced to surface south of Iceland. The crew abandoned ship and was pulled from the water by a British destroyer, but the rescue team wore Kriegsmarine uniforms. The officer in charge spoke perfect Berlin German. He greeted Teichert as a fellow commander, expressed sympathy for the loss of the boat, assured him that his crew would be taken to a German facility for debriefing and reassignment. Teichert, exhausted and grateful, never questioned it. Within 4 hours, he had revealed the complete patrol orders for his boat, discussed the new acoustic torpedoes being deployed, mentioned the location where U-456 had refueled from a supply submarine just 6 days earlier, and provided the grid coordinates where BDU had directed him to operate. All of this intelligence reached the Operational Intelligence Center before Teichert realized he was in British custody. When the truth was finally revealed, the psychological shock was severe. Teichert had not simply been captured. He had been deceived into betraying his command, his crew, his mission, all while believing he was doing his duty. The psychological impact on the broader U-boat service was devastating but difficult for German command to address. Captured crews began returning to Germany through prisoner exchanges or after the war ended, and they brought with them whispered warnings. Do not trust your rescuers. The British have men who speak perfect German. The uniforms are fake, everything is a lie. But how do you train sailors to distrust their own navy? How do you teach men to suspect everyone, even those wearing the correct uniform and speaking the correct language? German counterintelligence tried. They issued warnings. They changed protocols. They modified uniform designs, adding subtle markers that were supposed to be impossible to replicate, but British intelligence simply adapted. Every change was noted, every modification was copied, every new security measure was defeated by better research and more meticulous preparation. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. Now let us examine how the British uniform deception compared to what the Germans and Americans were attempting in their own intelligence operations. German intelligence services, particularly the Abwehr, employed extensive deception programs, but these were primarily focused on strategic misdirection rather than tactical interrogation. The Englandspiel operation in the Netherlands, for example, involved captured SOE radio operators being forced to continue transmissions to London under German control. This was effective but fundamentally different. It relied on controlling communication equipment, not manipulating human psychology in real-time interactions. When German intelligence did attempt uniform deception, it was usually in the context of commando operations, such as Operation Grafe during the Battle of the Bulge, where German soldiers wore American uniforms to create confusion behind enemy lines. These operations were short-term tactical disruptions, not sustained psychological manipulation programs. American intelligence services, particularly the Office of Strategic Services, developed sophisticated interrogation techniques, but they generally focused on creating discomfort and disorientation rather than false comfort. The OSS employed what they called the good cop, bad cop routine, where one interrogator would be aggressive while another offered sympathy. This was effective but transparent. Prisoners understood they were being manipulated. The goal was to make cooperation seem like the lesser of two evils, not to make prisoners forget they were prisoners at all. The closest American equivalent to the British uniform program was probably the work done at Fort Hunt, where German POWs were subjected to extensive surveillance and their conversations were recorded. But even there, prisoners knew they were in American custody. The surveillance was hidden, but the context was not. A comparison of results tells the story clearly. British uniform deception operations achieved intelligence extraction within hours, often minutes. German Abwehr operations required weeks or months of setup and provided strategic intelligence but rarely tactical details. American interrogation programs produced reliable intelligence but required extended timeframes and offered prisoners clear awareness of their situation. In the cold mathematics of intelligence gathering, the British uniform trick achieved something unique. It extracted maximum intelligence in minimum time by exploiting the most vulnerable moment in a prisoner's experience, the immediate aftermath of capture, before training and discipline could assert control. There were, of course, significant limitations and ethical considerations. The Geneva Conventions explicitly prohibited combatants from wearing enemy uniforms during combat, but the legal status of wearing enemy uniforms during post-capture interrogation occupied a gray area that international law had not clearly addressed. British legal advisors argued that since the deception occurred after surrender, not during combat, it did not violate the conventions. This interpretation was contested then and remains controversial now. From a purely operational perspective, the program also required extraordinary resources. Training personnel to speak fluent, culturally authentic German took months. Producing perfect uniform replicas required skilled craftsmen and detailed intelligence about German manufacturing processes. Maintaining the elaborate staged environments was expensive and logistically complex. Every captured crew had to be isolated completely from other prisoners to prevent the deception from being exposed prematurely. The program also created psychological casualties among the British personnel involved. Spending months pretending to be German, speaking only German, living within a manufactured German identity, took a toll on the interrogators themselves. Some reported difficulty switching back to their British identities. Others described feeling guilty about the depth of deception they had practiced on men who were, by the time they learned the truth, often grateful to their supposed rescuers for pulling them from the sea. The ethics of exploiting that gratitude, of weaponizing the natural human response to being saved, troubled some participants long after the war ended. Despite these limitations, the program continued to expand throughout 1943 and 1944. Additional facilities were established, more personnel were trained, the techniques were refined based on operational experience. By late 1944, British naval intelligence had developed what amounted to a complete parallel German naval infrastructure, existing solely to deceive captured U-boat crews. There were fake Kriegsmarine officers, fake naval bases, fake administrative processes, all designed to extract intelligence before prisoners realized they needed to protect it. The intelligence gathered through this program contributed significantly to Allied anti-submarine warfare. Patrol routes revealed through casual conversation allowed convoys to be rerouted. Discussions of mechanical problems identified vulnerabilities that could be exploited. Mentions of new weapons systems provided early warning that enabled countermeasure development. Officers who casually mentioned grid coordinates where they had encountered other U-boats never realized they were providing targeting information that would lead to additional sinkings. One particular success came in September 1943, when a captured engineering officer from U-338 casually mentioned a new type of snorkel device being installed on boats refitting in Brest. He described it in technical detail, explaining how it allowed submarines to run diesel engines while remaining submerged, dramatically extending underwater endurance. This information, extracted through friendly conversation over the course of an afternoon, reached British technical intelligence within hours. Countermeasures were developed. Radar systems were tuned to detect the small snorkel mast. Tactics were adjusted. When snorkel-equipped U-boats began operating in larger numbers months later, Allied forces were prepared, all because one tired engineer had felt comfortable discussing technical shop with what he believed was a fellow Kriegsmarine officer. The program's most significant impact may have been on German morale. As the war progressed and more U-boat crews were captured, whispers of the deception spread through the submarine service. Trust eroded. Men began to fear not just capture, but what they might reveal in the confusion after capture. This psychological pressure added to the already immense stress of U-boat service, where crews faced mortality rates exceeding 75% by war's end. Knowing that even survival might lead to unwitting betrayal created a burden that training could not relieve. Some crews discussed making suicide pacts rather than risk capture. Others simply struggled with the paranoia of wondering whether any rescue could be trusted. The uniform trick had turned the basic human instinct for self-preservation into a liability. When the war ended, the full extent of the program remained classified. Captured German officers who had been deceived were quietly informed of the truth, often years after their initial interrogation. Many expressed profound anger at the deception. Some never forgave what they saw as a fundamental betrayal of the warrior's code, the understanding that enemies might kill each other in battle but would treat prisoners with a basic level of honesty. Others, particularly those who came to understand how their information had been used, struggled with guilt, knowing that their casual revelations had contributed to the deaths of fellow sailors. British personnel involved in the program were bound by the Official Secrets Act and forbidden from discussing their work. Most took their stories to the grave. The legacy of the Uniform Deception Program extends beyond World War II. The techniques developed by British naval intelligence influenced post-war interrogation methodology across Western intelligence services. The understanding that psychological manipulation could be more effective than physical coercion became a foundation of Cold War intelligence work. The careful attention to cultural authenticity, the recognition that small details matter as much as big lies, the willingness to invest extraordinary resources in preparation, all of these lessons were carried forward into later conflicts. Modern intelligence services still study the program, not because they intend to replicate it exactly, but because it represents a particular kind of operational excellence, a willingness to approach intelligence gathering as a craft requiring patience, skill, and meticulous attention to human psychology. In the final accounting, the harmless British uniform trick transformed how naval intelligence understood the capture process. It proved that the most valuable intelligence comes not from breaking a prisoner's will, but from never allowing that will to form in the first place. It demonstrated that a perfect lie, maintained completely, can be more effective than any amount of pressure or persuasion. And it showed that sometimes the most powerful weapon is not a gun or a bomb or a code-breaking machine. Sometimes it is simply the right uniform, worn by the right person, at exactly the right moment. Those U-boats did not become prisons because of bars or guards or locked doors. They became prisons because the men inside them had already surrendered their secrets before they understood they were prisoners at all. That is the true genius of the deception. The most secure prison is the one that exists entirely in the mind.